are live. Welcome back, everybody, to the Solvable Mysteries Podcast, episode number 4. My name is Juras. As usual, I'm joined here by my co host, Glenn. How are you doing today, my friend?
Hi, great. I'm really excited about today's topic. It's one I've thought about for a long time.
Yeah, I bet, because today we're actually doing something different. We're taking a quick detour from our usual serial killer rapist thematic, and we're actually going to be discussing a UFO topic. So, without any further ado, today's topic is all about the 2004 USS Nimitz UFO incident. So, if you don't mind, Glenn, just a quick introduction to our audience about what actually went down.
Yeah, so this is a really exciting topic because what happened was the quick version is there was a UFO encounter off of the coast of California, so off of just not too far really from where I live. And it was out in the ocean, and it involved our Navy pilots, and it involved a recording, and the people involved are actually talking about it. It's worth noting that the New York Times is the one that broke the story, I guess, to the rest of the public. The story had been floating around for several years, basically since the event in 2004. But it was only in 2017 that the New York Times did a big long article, and it was their most popular article ever. It was tremendously popular. I think it did way better than they had even expected, and as a result, there has been more follow up, and I think that brings us to where we are today, where we're going to go over some of the latest and greatest on this case, go over some of
Yep.
the implications, and then talk about how we could solve this mystery potentially.
Right, so I was thinking I'm going to give our audience a quick, brief rundown of what actually happened, and then we will get into the details for say. So basically, the event happened in 2004, so it was November 2004. A missile cruiser named USS Princeton, I will quickly change the visual here. So basically, this ship has been monitoring and tracking unidentified objects days before the actual encounter, and it just happened to be so that on November 14th, two airborne US Navy Super Hornets, led by Captain David Fravor, have been conducting military drills, just general military drills for preparation for potential combat in the I believe Arabian Sea. And basically they were conducting, so I will just quickly show the visuals of the planes that were doing the drills. So basically these drills have been performing their training right around the general area where the USS Princeton has once again detected the anomaly, the UFO, for say, and Princeton's radio officer Kevin Day had contacted the pilots that were performing the drills to just inform them that there was a suspicious UFO floating around in and about their general area, and he instructed the pilots to go and investigate the UFO. And once the pilots arrived to the general area, they actually, at first, they didn't really see anything, and after a while, they noticed a how should I put it, a area of water that was an oval area of water that was just churning, and after a brief moments they actually witnessed an unidentified UFO that was just hovering over the water at around like what was it, like 50 feet above the water, and it was making erratic movements. So Commander David Fravor decided to investigate the anomaly. He started descending towards that UFO, and the UFO just accelerated and vanished into the distance within like 1 second or something crazy like that. So after that, the both planes, the aircraft got another rendezvous point. So they decided to, like after the event, the pilots were pretty weirded out, but they got another rendezvous point to just basically go to. And once they started to approach that rendezvous point, USS Princeton once again contacted the pilots and informed them that at that exact rendezvous point, the UFO has emerged once again, and that point was like 60 miles away. So this unidentified object actually managed to cover 60 miles within like 1 or 2 minutes or something crazy like that. So once other ships, other aircraft went to investigate that area, the UFO was already gone and it was never heard or seen again. So basically, that's the rough rundown of what actually happened. Since you are the UFO expert of Solvable Mysteries Podcast, Glenn, I guess just take it away.
Yeah. So, full disclosure about my experience with this topic. So, I've been interested in UFOs since I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. I think the first time my parents let me watch the Spielberg movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is still an excellent movie.
Yep.
But yeah, since then I've been kind of back and forth in the topic. I think when I was a little kid, I was kind of a true believer, and then the older I got, the more skepticism I had about it. It's worth mentioning, and we may very well do some shows in the future on sort of the higher level topics around this, the meta topics, let's say.
Definitely.
Things like the Fermi Paradox that feed into why or why not you might think UFOs are real or aliens, etc. I've certainly tried to take a balanced approach, but what had happened is in the past couple of years, you've seen media outlets start to take the topic more seriously. And I think that this particular incident is a great example to really look at it and look at some of the issues involved and understand why something like this may or may not come to the surface, why people may or may not want to report it, and the reactions of other people and how that reaction has changed over the years. So, as Juras mentioned, there was this event off of the coast of California. Essentially what happened was the Princeton, which was part of the carrier task group. So when you have an aircraft carrier running around the oceans, it doesn't travel by itself. It has a whole bunch of ships along, kind of like a big party. And those ships are there to do different things. Some of them turn on radar so they can see aircraft or missiles that might be attacking the task group. That's what it's called, task group,
Yeah.
or task force. Carrier group is what is often referred to as a CG. And you will have ships like this Princeton ship, which is an Aegis-type cruiser. Quick history on that was as the United States military got through the 50s and 60s, and as the Navy sort of transformed from being about battleships to, in World War II, being about carriers, and now we're still about carriers. Some say maybe we're too much about carriers still. What happened was we started to realize that, hey, this carrier that we spent billions of dollars on, guess what? A relatively inexpensive Chinese or Russian missile could sink it right down to the bottom of the ocean really quickly, and that would undermine your whole force. So what happened was the military started focusing on radars that could detect really fast-moving objects. We're talking about objects that are moving 3 to, I don't know, maybe 7 times the speed of sound. I think some missiles go even faster. That's an extremely fast object. I mention this because why this is relevant. The Aegis cruiser was a new generation of cruisers that the United States built, and we incorporated some radar technology in it. And right there on your image, you can see it. One of the images, you see that big flat panel, that big white thing?
Are you talking about this thing?
Yep, that big octagon-looking thing.
Yep.
Or is it an octagon?
Yeah,
yep.
I believe.
So there's several of those around the ship. Those are actually a special kind of radar that it can kind of do a bunch of things at once, is the short version. So this is relevant because what happened is one of the radar operators on the ship had been tracking some weird objects for about 2 weeks. And it wasn't just this one radar operator. Fravor on the Rogan podcast, I believe, or another source, was saying that in fact up to 70 different people on different ships had been seeing this weird activity, and I'll mention later how I think there's probably much more people that have seen this on radar. Anyways, they were seeing objects do really, really weird things, like go from like 20,000 feet down to like the ocean surface in a matter of seconds. They were seeing the objects do weird things, move in ways that seem to violate our laws of physics, how we understand physics, objects that don't seem to respect inertia, objects that seem to be able to turn on a dime in a way that we think would be fatal normally to like any kind of organic occupant, so like an alien or a person or whatever inside the ship, and even machinery is potentially, vulnerable to these kind of G-forces. Anyway, it was doing a lot of wacky stuff, and what happened was, as you mentioned, Commander Fravor and another airplane were doing some drills. They were doing some war games against one of the other squadrons, I think from their same ship, against the Marine Squadron. And in the middle of their exercise, this radar operator from the Princeton rings on. He's like, hey, guess what? Can you just hold on the exercise for a second? We have a real-world vector, meaning a real-world like mission, that they're going to vector them off to. Meaning, by vector, they mean, send you off in a line to go look at this thing. So that's really exciting because, people in the military, they train a lot. They often look forward to the opportunity to prove their skills. So this was one of those cases. So they go off. They have no idea what they're going to go look at. It is interesting that because this was a drill that they were in the middle of, the only armament on the airplanes were these fake missiles. So essentially they have training missiles that do not fire. Yeah, they're literally bolted onto the plane and they don't come off, but they let the planes exercise their equipment. So the planes were fully armed in terms of like their sensors and their ability to discern targets, but they just could not shoot anything down. So they go over to this area where these operators had been seeing over the past 2 weeks these objects kind of flit in and out and do really weird things that like didn't seem real. And I'll go into why radar operators might be skeptical of that, because there's a history around that. But they thought, you have airplanes nearby, it's not that far, send them over. So they did. They go over there, and what at first Commander Fravor thought he was at maybe the scene of a plane crash, because he didn't see anything. The only thing he saw was a cross-shaped object just under the surface of the water. And that, in a normal circumstance would be what a crashed airplane might look like. A crashed airplane, right? It sinks just under the water. Maybe it's still buoyant enough to not totally sink. That's what he thought he was seeing. And then he sees this thing kind of hovering above it. So the water was extremely clear that day. It was sort of a novel day off the coast of Southern California, Mexico, where it was very clear. So the visibility was extremely good, and the water was extremely calm. So that made it all the more noticeable when this thing was kind of roiling the waters. So this thing was roiling the waters over there, and there's this little, what they called a tic tac. And for those outside of America or any market that might have this product, a tic tac is a breath mint product in the United States.
We have those. You
guys have it? Okay. So
I have them on my table as we speak, actually.
Tic Tacs have made it internationally. And this event certainly was like the best accidental advertisement for a candy since E.T. That wasn't so accidental. So it's basically a rounded object. It's not a spear. It's sort of like if you took a spear and stretched it on both ends. So almost like a really blunt cucumber or something.
I feel like most people who are listening to this podcast, they probably know what a tic tac is. That's just my rough guess, I would say.
No, I get it. Yeah. Sort of dumbing it down a little bit. Yeah. So it was about 40 feet long. So it was about the same size, Fravor estimates, as his own aircraft. It just didn't look anything like his aircraft. It didn't look like anything. Didn't look like any other kind of aircraft ever that he had ever seen. And that, I think, is where you start to get into very interesting stuff here, where he sees this object. He's trying to get a better look. They're trying to get a radar lock, but they cannot. So that's the first interesting point, is that the ship was able to track this object on radar. And the ship has much more complex radar. But the F-18s could not, in this event or similar events that he mentioned in the Joe Rogan podcast and some of the other articles about this whole scenario have mentioned, no one was ever able to really get a lock. In some cases, they were able to lock on some of their camera equipment. They have targeting pods that have cameras, both normal TV cameras and infrared, that can lock on and use some computer technology to basically keep the object centered in the targeting window.
Yeah.
But radar wasn't working, so that right away was weird. And Fravor, in his most recent conversation, and Juras and I were very lucky because we decided on this topic about a week ago, and then just coincidentally, I believe, if I'm getting the chronology right, Joe Rogan had Fravor on for a conversation, and that was just great for us because we were able to hear the conversation fresh and hear him talk about it.
Yep.
And get a really extended story straight from the horse. So he's trying to lock on it, and then he tells the other airplane to still stay orbiting up at like 12,000 feet, and he's going to dive down and take a look at this thing that's hovering over the water to try to see what the heck it is. As he starts to spiral down, and he's taking his time, he's being deliberate and careful because he doesn't want to accidentally crash into the ocean. And he said that was a definite possibility. If you get too locked on a target, if your attention gets too distracted, you might accidentally you can lose your perspective of where the ocean is.
Yeah.
He's coming down. He comes down in a big spiral, and as he does that, the object leaves the water, leaves the hover position over the water, and starts to spiral an exact mirror of him, but upwards. So if that makes sense, he's coming down, the thing's spiraling up. They're kind of circling around each other. And at some point, Fravor gets impatient with this, and he's like, you know what, I'm just going to get closer. So he hangs a quick turn and tries to cut across the circle to get close to it. And the thing just zips away. And it was just amazing to them because the speed was something that far exceeded what they had ever seen any object do. And these are, of course, extremely experienced pilots that have like above average eyesight, above average intelligence. They have a lot of experience engaging other flying objects. So like other pilots, they have extremely good judgment, I think, about distances, sizes, things like that. No one's perfect, but I want to set the stage here about why this witness might be more reliable than, let's say, some hobbyist tinkering around in his Cessna.
Yeah, I would actually like to mention, just to give you a quick breather, that basically David Fravor, I don't remember if it was on the Joe Rogan podcast or on the Fighter Jet podcast, another podcast that he was a guest on. He stated that this was the only UFO he has witnessed in like over 20 years of military service. So I think that's also interesting to note that this man was flying planes for more than 20 years, and this is the only time he saw a UFO. So it's not like he was seeing them every other week. It was a pretty rare occurrence.
Yeah, that's worth calling out for a lot of good reasons, because unfortunately, much like other topics that are kind of like, let's say, quote unquote paranormal or outside of what let's say official science folks like to position, sometimes you end up with kind of unreliable witnesses. I'll be really frank about him. For the most part, I trust his testimony. When he sounded pretty no nonsense, and while he did say that people like he said his mother-in-law was always asking him, before this happened, his mother-in-law was always asking him if he saw any UFOs, because his mother-in-law really liked the topic. So there were people in his life that were kind of wanting him to see UFOs, but he never saw one until this happened. And then he couldn't even tell his mother-in-law for years afterwards until the story broke, I think somewhere else. It's good to kind of see that I do worry a little bit. The one thing, I'll just mention this right now, I do worry, and they even addressed this on the podcast, I do worry that someone like this, if their living becomes too much about the UFOs, they start to
Mm,
sound. You know what I mean? Sometimes,
yeah.
sometimes they fall into a trap where it's almost like they fall into a UFO quote unquote religion,
Mm,
where they, you know what I mean, they become a true believer, and then it's like that. That's where I think it's unfortunate because um, I always feel like this topic shouldn't be a religious topic, and by religion I mean that in a really general term, or like any kind of ideology, right? So
yeah.
I get a little bit worried sometimes that someone like this will get sucked into a position where if they ever discover something that undermines their own testimony, or that like resolves it, oh, that was actually just secret defense probe number 9, you
Yeah.
know, like that someone like that is going to, it's going to be harder for them to go back and say, oh, you know what, I was wrong, all those hours all those
Yeah.
hours of podcasts you listened to,
Yeah.
forget it, it was just an airplane. Yeah, so that
Yeah, yeah.
that's the one thing I worry. But yeah, I mean, he's a very credible witness. Like as you attested to, he had extreme amounts of experience. He had a position of responsibility that I think he said on the Rogan podcast. He was like in like the top 10 people in terms of authority on that aircraft carrier.
Out of
The
like
aircraft,
6,000 people, right?
yeah, out of like 5,000 6,000 people. Yeah, he was like in the top 10.
Yeah.
He was commander of his squadron. I think there's multiple squadrons, but he was commander in one of them. And he was even like, there was actually funny enough, right before this event happened, or right
Hmm.
around the time, there was a reality TV program about carriers that was about this carrier, because the Nimitz. The Nimitz is one of our most famous carriers. It's named after one of our most famous admirals. I think it was one of our first super carriers. Might have been our super carrier. The whole class of super carriers is named after the Nimitz.
It's a
Um,
very nice ship, definitely. You know.
it's
Yeah. So I think at this point, should we flip to the actual footage and see
yeah.
what the pilots actually picked up? So I will just play the footage and then we can discuss what actually happened. So this is the footage. It's 1 minute and 16 seconds long. So if anyone's listening to this podcast not on YouTube, I highly suggest that you actually go to our YouTube channel and watch the footage on our basically visuals. Yeah, I mean, this is a soundless image, footage almost, so you can definitely provide
Okay.
commentary if you want, so there's
Cool.
no
Yeah.
issue, yeah.
So then, just to be precise in the facts, Fravor mentioned that his plane wasn't the one that was able to get a target lock, or on this the screen that we're seeing, but it was actually the other plane. The other plane that was with him. I think it was no, actually, I think I got that wrong. I think what it was is his flight of two planes saw this thing, and then what was interesting was when all this was happening, when the thing disappeared,
Yeah,
they went and they were like, okay, well let's go back to where we were going to go, where our starting point for the exercise, and the UFO was at their starting point. So somehow it knew, and it went. And that sounds
yeah.
suspicious in
Th-
itself. That's a
that's
little bit,
that's a good
yeah.
point. That's a good point.
But
This is very suspicious. Yeah.
it went a distance of 60 miles, which, because the point was 60 miles away, it went that distance in what seems like almost no time, like maybe a second, which is right there. 60 miles in a second is way faster than anything we here on Earth so far have been able to make
by
happen.
by far, I would say.
Yeah.
And I believe this is the exact moment when the footage ends, so the UFO disappears, and so yeah, let's just play it.
And there's another one that's also similar to this one, where they're trying to track it and they're trying to lock the screen. And Fravor actually gave a little color commentary, just like I'm doing, on that clip.
Mm.
So it was from another flight. I think it was from the other coast, where something similar happened. Just as a side note, for any of our listeners that might be gamers, if you might play military flight simulations like DCS, it was fun for me because
Hmm.
Fravor was explaining all the things you see on the screen, and I at this point I already knew, because I've been playing DCS F-18 for for like a month and a half,
Oh,
and
wow. So
so I know
you're
how to use all
telling,
these screens.
yeah,
Right?
so you're telling me that you actually understand, let's just pause the video. You actually understand like all the little letters and numbers on the screen right now?
A lot of it, yeah, a lot of it. Not everything, because the program, the F-18 is still in early access, so they haven't they unfortunately haven't finished everything. But yeah, most of it, most of what's going on, whether it's the OPR up on the
Cool.
upper left that's operational, or showing, yeah, just different things. It was pretty cool to kind of hear him confirm it, and I was like, oh, now I know what they're talking about. So yeah, Fravor talked about this incident, and he said when he got back to the ship, of course, they all got teased about it and UFOs, and on the ship newsletter, they made a little editorial cartoon making fun of them. But people didn't laugh as much when the other flight showed up with a disc with the data of this recording, saying, "Well, what's this thing?" And that's when things got a lot more serious. Now, what's especially interesting about this was the video came out. This story had been talked about for a long time. So it turns out on forums and kind of message boards and things like that for fighter pilots and people like me that just like fighters and things like that. The story had been around for a while, but it wasn't until the New York Times article, which also coincided with releasing information about one of the official programs, which coincidentally just ended, where the government supposedly had gotten alarmed about things like this and put some money towards it. Now, the amount of money that the government supposedly was spending on this project was so tiny and laughable. It was like something ridiculous, like, I don't know, $4 million a year or something. And it turns out, for clarity, someone on that same podcast clarified that there's actually two official programs. But once again, the money as a fraction of our defense budget, and
Four
United
four
States,
million is for United States. 4 million doesn't mean anything. So I definitely
that's
think,
like toothpicks.
yeah, that's definitely nothing, and I feel like it was blown out of proportion. It's like if it was a serious, I don't know, military campaign or something, it would have to have a lot more money than that. This is like, I don't know, like a rookie in the NBA, like his salary for 1 year. So it's
Oh my,
it's
yeah.
really nothing. You know what I'm saying?
Our defense budget is so huge. I mean, it literally, I think until recently, now that China is finally spending more on their defense, but it might still be true. It used to be that the rest of the world's defense budgets combined were still less than the United States defense
I
budget.
feel like it's still the same thing, don't you think? I know that
Yeah.
China is second, then Saudi Arabia, and I believe then Russia or something like that. But still, the USA is like, I don't know the exact number, but it was always like around that $700 million. I mean billion, of course, $700 billion mark. So it's almost like $1 trillion every year. So, and I believe
Yeah.
China is like a little over 200 billion. So it's still like almost like four times, what the Chinese spend, and Chinese standing army is like 2 or 3 times larger than the US. So you can't really compare, the amount of money that the US spends on military with anyone. It's just
Yeah.
it's a bizarre amount of money, but I definitely understand why it's being spent.
Yeah, yeah, and that was the kind of the problem around sometimes too much spending, depending on what your stance is here in the U.S. Eisenhower, one of our most famous presidents, called that the military industrial complex. So the tendency for kind of industrial powers in America, defense contractors, to influence things so that the U.S. spends more money, and that's truly the case because we spend a lot of money. So it is laughable. So here's the thing: I want to get into a couple of deep topics here about why this was so important and why it's just a UFO, right? At the end of the day, it's like, oh, okay, something cool in video, and sometimes I think people look at this and they're like, oh, it's just another cool thing that happened. Oh, it's kind of mysterious, and I think people don't think deeply enough about this topic because it's interesting. Like today, you and I, Juras, we're doing a deviation from kind of our the tone we set for the first 3 episodes, which were about kind of grisly murders and things that people find very frightening on like a personal level, right?
Yep.
Everyone's right. Aren't you frightened about the idea of somebody coming into your house and doing something to you.
Yeah,
Well,
that's definitely, that's definitely a change in pace on this week's episode.
so then that is it's interesting because a lot of people might find this more lighthearted, but I'm going to argue in a few minutes that
Okay.
the ramifications of this of an event like this UFO, the ramifications are actually much bigger for all of us, and it's something that's worth taking pause about because depending what's going on, and I have a couple different scenarios, they're all kind of disturbing in ways that I think exceed like kind of the smaller world of murders and serial killers and spree killers, which are like kind of like they're horrible, but they're also in some way a normal part of the life that humans go through. This is something that seems a lot stranger and has some bigger implications. Before I get into that, and I'm blabbing a lot this episode for sure because I'm so
No,
excited
it's
about
you are
it.
carrying the podcast because, as I've mentioned before, you are the UFO expert. I was never really much of a UFO person, but I believe that's just because UFOs don't really get reported in Eastern
Yeah.
Europe as much, and it's more of a US thing. But I'm definitely intrigued and I'm excited to talk about this topic and many more to come about UFOs.
Perfect. Yeah. So this one. Let's get into real quick. Even how much UFOs get reported. So it's interesting. Now there's a follow-up article I saw this same week. I think because Fravor went on Rogan, everyone else is like, hey, let's kind of tag team off this topic and see if we can get some collateral
Right.
traffic from it. So they actually interviewed the radar operator from the cruiser, the Princeton, and he said that they only started seeing these objects once again on these radars that were designed to track really high speed, extremely high speed objects coming in, flying around that might be missiles. They only started seeing them after basically a firmware upgrade. So there's a
Hmm.
firmware upgrade to the whole fleet. And after that, not just him, but other radar operators across the fleet, not just on the western coast, but on the eastern coast and other areas of deployment, they started seeing these objects. Now, this is where I'm going to rewind a little bit. I read a book about a year ago, and it was a fairly recent book. I'll have to find the name of it, but it was reviewing cases like this where it wasn't just normal people, civilians. It was the military or the government having some sort of interaction with UFOs. And there's a lot of actually pretty good cases that are as compelling as this, and certainly we may have a chance to go over them in future episodes. I'm calling this out because when radar was invented, radar is always a work in progress. So radar does a lot of things, and in the early days of radar, they were getting so many weird returns back, sometimes just weird echoes. You send out a radar wave,
Hmm.
it bounces off everything out there. It bounces off even the clouds, who knows? Bounces off of birds, bounces off of trees on the ground. So they had to make filters. They had to make things to cut down on what was being tracked. And one of the filters they put in for radars like this was when things did things, when an object gave a return that was doing something that just didn't seem logical. So if you saw an object going 20,000 miles an hour,
Hmm.
well, no airplanes on Earth go 20,000 miles an hour. So to kind of make life easier on the radar operators, they put these filters in, these software filters that would, not show things. Well, here's the thing. Suppose there really is something that can go 20,000 miles an hour and make like crazy tight turns and be in one place one moment, another place another moment, 60 miles away.
Hmm.
um, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're never going to track that on radar if you've designed your radar never to track it, right?
Yeah.
So
Makes sense. Yeah.
right, you're blinding yourself to the evidence if there is evidence, but you have to be in the mindset that there is evidence. So this is interesting to think that like potentially this has been going on for a long time and just radar operators weren't seeing it. And I'll add another note that radar operators had, in fact, despite the filters, been seeing things like this. One of the things that's so interesting about Fravor coming forward, he must not think that he has much to lose, or he must think that he has really good credibility, because some of the other famous cases that we'll discuss probably in the future like airline pilots and people like that were really reluctant to officially go on record because they didn't want to hurt their career. And that included the radar operator people, that included anybody that was associated with, because air travel and air safety is such a serious topic for all of us. Just the implication that anything might be wrong with your perceptions or your mind or your senses could be enough. You know what I mean? Like here you are, an airliner pilot. You had a military career before that, which was great. Now you're flying planes for the airlines and making good money. You love your life. You know, it's easier than the military now. You're traveling the world, and then something happens, and you're like, okay, I could either talk about this one weird night and suffer for the rest of my career, or I can shut up about it and
enjoy your life.
Yeah, enjoy your life.
Makes perfect sense. I didn't even think about this like this thing, but it definitely makes sense. Yeah, this aspect makes sense because if you're going to have a successful career as a commercial pilot, for say, you better act and seem perfect, because like, if for say an airplane crashes, like the stocks of an airline just plummet like crazy, so yeah, it definitely makes sense what you just said. Definitely, I didn't even think about this. Yeah,
in fact, a couple of the more recent air crashes, I think one was a Lufthansa where the guy committed suicide. They think he intentionally steered the airplane into a mountain. And then there's that one Indonesian plane that disappeared. Yep. Anyways, whenever something like this happens, there's a lot of scrutiny on the pilot about their mental state. And can you only imagine if, like, case in point, one of these people had like reported on a UFO, it went into their official file, and then a crash happened somehow. And then years later, when the lawsuits happen, this thing comes up during discovery for the trial, and they're like, oh my God, this guy was crazy, and you guys never took him off the flight line, and oh my God, you 300 people are dead because of you. Yeah. So that's, you know what I mean? That's just like American Airlines doesn't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that. American Airlines is not interested in UFOs. Now here's
definitely.
Here's interesting. It's just an interesting thing is that because this thing that happened in this event, this 2004 event.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to cut you off. Just a quick brief thing I want to say, like, because we have been pointing to this exact area right here on the Google Maps. This is the exact coordinates of the event. Just for people who are watching this on YouTube wondering why are we showing this exact spot, this is the exact coordinates of the event that actually the UFO encounter. And definitely continue what you were saying.
Yeah, definitely, and it's right outside of our main West Coast Naval Base, which is down in San Diego. Yep. So there's always all sorts of carriers. There's an air base. In fact, I just went to an air show at the Marine Corps Air Base down there, and that's all within easy flying distance of the ships that are in and out of there. So so here's something that's interesting is there's always been a lot of speculation about unofficial or secret studies of UFOs and UFO technology, if they're real, if it's real, if the things really happen. There's always been a lot of talk for decades that maybe there are secret programs. These other programs, though, the ones that are public, that one is closed down now, and supposedly for the big wastage of money, though of course we spend more on plastic spoons probably a year for the military than we do for this program. They said that they got interested in it because these things were happening enough. These close calls with things almost hitting. Apparently, like one of these objects almost hit a fighter in another incident. And I think there were a couple like that where they're like, you know what, this is an actual hazard to our defense aircraft. So this is interesting because it kind of is full circle now. Everybody not reporting on a problem. If there is a problem, it finally comes around and bites you on the butt. If there is a real problem and everyone's pretending like the emperor has no, no one wants to say the emperor has no clothes. So this is what happened is the Navy specifically decided on their own that, no matter what they were being told to ignore or not look at, or that didn't happen, there were enough things happening to their personnel that, like a good employer, they're like, you know what, we need to do a safety investigation about what this is. Now, this is where I get really frustrated because,
Okay.
this is just me on this topic, and I'm just going to vent for a second because this is where you get into some of the other implications of this. Safety would be much lower on my list of concerns. So if this is a good time, I'll just, and I think we're getting probably to the meat and getting close to the conclusion here. I want to mention some takeaways because certainly this episode has so many details that anybody could go and look at the video and read the New York Times article, and I recommend they do. But I think it's good to kind of, what the articles don't mention is what we're about to talk about right now, sort of like getting closer to solving it, or at least making some steps. So, okay.
Given our podcast name, we should
right.
we should probably get around actually trying to solve some mysteries, and I think it's funny that we mentioned this at like probably the least possible solvable case out there, but let's
No way I
let's give
solved
it a
it.
shot.
No way. I have it on good intelligence that my answer is right. No,
Okay.
I'm kidding. No, yeah, no. Of course, you're right. This is like this is almost like a ghost thing in some ways. But I feel like it shouldn't be, and maybe someday it won't. Maybe someday there will be enough attention where we can kind of figure out what the heck is going on. Okay, so let's just lay it out. So there's an object. Actually, and it was more than one object because these other accounts, both from Fravor, from people he talked to, but also other articles. There's another site called thedrive.com that has I think it's called the war room section. They have a section that like just talks about these kind of things. And this is just one of several things like this that happened recently. Objects being traced on radar, etc. So, okay, you have an object that is doing things that not only seem to violate the laws of physics, but seem to rule out, I mean, you don't even see how like a living occupant could be in that vehicle unless they have some kind of science to shield that occupant from the extreme G-forces. We're talking about G-forces that are like well above 9 Gs. We're talking about G-forces that would probably squish something that wasn't protected by some kind of strange anti-gravity field or whatever inside of it. And of course, people have seized on this. You have the usual suspects, kind of like the I won't even mention their names because some people really love these people, some people really don't. Anyway, you have kind of the usual folks in the UFO community seizing on this. So that's why I want to be really careful. But from appearances and from what the other videos have shown and the other accounts, which, like I mentioned, because they're military and because they have more to lose and because they were still pretty adamant and seem to have like backups, like they have video backup. There's radar backup, which they won't release because it exposes some other information about how our defense capabilities work. But there's like some kind of semi-concrete proof out there. So here's my first question is, if this isn't us, if this isn't our own technology, which I don't really get. If this was a secret, like this is what I've heard from skeptics. Skeptics say, okay, so first thing skeptics say is, oh, well, that's just a drone. And it's like, okay, well, that drone is doing things that no other drone can do. And
in 2004, by the way.
2004, yeah, 2004, and now, I mean, we're nowhere close to that. I mean, the drones that we have are basically little tiny helicopters, and they're not even as good as helicopters in some ways. They are a little more nimble. But they can't do what this drone did. They can't outfly an F-18.
Definitely.
So that's one issue, and it's like, okay, so why would we sit on that tech when that tech could transform the world? Why would we expose it to a bunch of random military fighters in an event that for sure was going to get word of mouth and eventually get out like it did? It doesn't make sense. So then they say, oh, well, maybe it's China or Russia or one of our other global competitors.
Also doesn't make sense to me because I feel like the whole thing that the Russians or the Chinese have the capability of making like more advanced weapons or like military equipment than the US. Given the fact how much money the US spends on its military, I think it's out of the question. So I'm definitely with you on this regard that it's I definitely don't believe it was like a secret USA developed military weapon or something like that. It sounds too crazy to me.
Yeah, and then it also begs the question that if this was, humans on Earth, if this was us or some other regional competitor, um, where did they get the technology for this? How did they suddenly, seemingly leap a century or more in technology, yet have no signs of this technology anywhere else? What I mean? We're not seeing like floating
Yeah.
cars in China. We're not seeing floating cars here. We're not seeing a lot of the other things that you think would be at least some aspect of this technology.
Maybe
So
maybe it was Japan. I'm
that's right.
joking. I'm
Yeah.
joking.
Well, they're always pretty advanced. It's true. They've always been ahead of the technology curve, and that's a country that for sure. But yeah, even them, it's like where would this come from? So that's interesting because you could go down a whole rabbit hole of like, if it was us,
Yeah.
did things like Roswell really happen? Like was there some at some point where we either recovered some kind of alien
Mm.
or interdimensional technology, or did we have a meeting? Did we, there's a whole cool
Mm.
fictional or semi-fictional or truthful way you could go with this, but it's a pretty set of disturbing questions. Okay, so that's one.
Yeah.
Next is, okay, let's say it's not us. So that's where I think this topic gets a lot more disturbing. So if it's not us, and this gets to what's something called the Fermi Paradox. The Fermi Paradox, which I would love to go in bigger detail in another show,
Definitely.
is that Enrico Fermi, a famous physicist, he was going he was taking a lunch break with a bunch of other famous physicist coworkers on our Manhattan project during the war.
Hmm.
And they were just talking about UFOs and aliens. They were talking about aliens, like, oh, what are the chances in our whole huge universe, in our infinite universe, seemingly infinite universe, what are the chances there are life? And he did kind of a couple of back of the envelope calculations, like, a super genius like that would be able to do in
Hmm.
his head. And he's like, well, there still should be like tons of life out there, and then some percentage of it should be intelligent. If that is true, where is everybody? So I mentioned this because for a long time, and it gets more complicated. You say, well, from his point of view, we should be getting visited all the time. Just from like that kind of infinite point of view,
Hmm.
we are. I think our planet is a little newer than some other planets and star systems in the universe. So like there should have been other civilizations that got way ahead of our level of progress just through just pure infinite numbers.
Makes
Um,
sense.
and then even there are ways, even with the speed of light limitation, which I often question, because that's just a rule that we've made based on what we think, how we think things work. But obviously things work in ways that we don't know yet. Um, they'll look at like, well, they'll say, oh, well, it takes so long for the speed of light to explore, but it turns out, oh no, you could make like self-replicating probes that, like, if you send a probe that could build a copy of itself to another planet, and it makes a copy of itself there, and then those probes go in two more directions, you could actually explore the whole galaxy in a relatively small amount of time. I mean, it's still like a million years, but a civilization that was really advanced, a million years, it could get a lot done. So that's where we're like, why are they not showing up on our
Hmm.
doorstep? Now, I would argue that things like this prove that they are showing up in our doorstep, that they are happening. There's some other books I've read, like I said, and I really try to be critical about
Hmm.
this. I used to work as a researcher for Sony. I'm fully aware of the need to check your sources, to check for bias,
Right.
and the fact that before the internet age, for as much misinformation as we see out there, I can tell you as a researcher that a lot of the things that we assumed were true because we read it in a book in the 80s or 90s, in fact, were based on false premises. So I'm pretty skeptical. I really try to be even-minded about this, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's to the point where it's like, okay, to me, if things like this get covered up, well, then it's like, okay, how are you ever going to prove? Like, there are none so blind as those who will not see, right? So,
Mm.
like from my perspective, I do wonder, the people that say there should be aliens everywhere. Where are they? I would say, well, it kind of seems like things, like we keep getting these stories of like things showing up.
Yeah.
To me, that could be aliens. Now, the other part, and as I just said, this is a Fermi Paradox show
Yeah.
topic, but when we look out in our telescopes, we don't see what we call mega scale constructions. So we don't see like kind of huge constructions around other star systems that we would expect to see. So
Right.
that is troubling, and that's certainly worth delving into. But that's kind of where some of that comes from, where people don't think that there's aliens and think that maybe we're the only ones around. Um, Before I go into kind of my next little point around that,
Yeah, so funny you mentioned, yeah, you might see where I'm going with this visual. I have it set on Egypt, so basically with the whole fact of the Giza pyramids and things like that, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that aliens are visiting us just recently, just as of late as we had the technology to have footage of UFOs and so on. Like there are a lot of like ancient structures that cannot really be explained, like the pyramids in Egypt, and Inca, Aztec buildings. There's the Stonehenge, that you can't really explain. So I'm definitely with you on that part, that I'm definitely open-minded, but again, I didn't really put much thought into aliens and UFOs. So I'm still like not, I guess, well enough informed to make a statement, like that.
and it's worth calling out too that like some of those ancient works of art or ancient monuments, some of them have depictions that look very similar to
Mm.
kind of what we now stereotype as like aliens in fiction or in works of art. So yeah, it is kind of interesting to think. Like I think even on the podcast, Rogan's other guest, the guy that filmed the movie with Lazar, was mentioning that even
Hmm.
Christopher Columbus recorded some kind of UFO encounter or sighting on his way over to America.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I'll try not to go too much longer on this point, but yeah, there's a whole question about who would this even be. Now, the other thing I want to point out is if there is a speed of light limitation, that generally means that beings from far away could not come here in person. Well, that still doesn't rule out, like at this point, we have enough automated, autonomous drones that it kind of makes sense from our own point of view now that maybe some of these craft could potentially just be drones themselves and not actually have people in them. But here's the other thing: is
Alien, you
some
mean like
aliens,
aliens? Yeah,
yeah,
like
yeah,
aliens from different, like galaxies and
different
so
places.
on. They just send like like drones to spy
Send the
on the
send the
humans.
robot, or
Yeah.
even, well, here's the other thing is, and this is one of the things I'm going to mention this because I want to be
Hmm.
fair to the topic. Um, One of the things people point out about when people say they have alien encounters, so aliens actually coming out of the flying saucer or whatever, is that they tend to look a lot like us. Now that's kind of a red flag
Mm.
because it seems pretty unlikely that a random alien species, unless they sought us out specifically because we look like them,
Right.
it's, you know what I mean, that they would have the exact like evolved primate form
With
that we
like
are now.
the big weird eyes and like
Yeah,
the
but
oval shaped head. Yeah.
the almost looking, and this is where I'm going next, almost looking like a future version of us where we had become so dependent on technology for things like reproduction and keeping us safe that like really we didn't need our human form anymore. Now on one hand you could say, well, maybe even those bodies are just organic robots where they're like, you know what, I'm gonna kick it back here on planet X, and
Mm.
I'm gonna send my avatar, right, just like the movie Avatar. I'm gonna send my robot avatar
Hmm.
that it's just kind of looks like non-threatening enough. maybe they think that like that's non-threatening enough that like we won't be totally freaked out by them. But the real being could be like a blob of slime or something, or a swarm of bees. You know,
Yeah, I definitely get what you're saying, but to that point, if they have the ability to make like that weird alien, look alike, why wouldn't they just make a replica of a human being? Like they would
exactly.
probably have the capability to if their intention is to not get caught and to spy on the human race, I think an advanced alien civilization, they could probably have the capabilities of creating like human like robots, and these robots could just blend in to the society.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean that's an excellent point. I think based on that, I think we really do need to do a Fermi paradox show someday.
Definitely.
So I'll kind of I'll circle up on what my next point was. So okay, so here's the other thing is, yeah, like you said, they could just make clones of us or something like that, and sometimes that has actually been reported that like the aliens, the quote unquote aliens, look like people from Northern Europe, where it's like okay, maybe that's what that is. Now
Mm.
here's the other possibility. Let's suppose people are right that for some reason we are like this really unique life form that exists in our galaxy and or universe, and that there may be other things that are keeping other living beings from getting to our point of advancement. Well, then the other conclusion you might make is that these are, this is going to sound weird, either interdimensional people or time travelers. So it could be our own descendants coming back in
Mm.
time. Now, once again, that's another one of those things where it's like, well, if we're going to if we invent time machines in the future, we probably should be seeing time travelers now. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, but also, yeah, this is like a really, really deep, deep subject. Like the time travel, I don't really get it because it seems a lot simpler than it actually is. I've seen like this movie, man, I cannot remember the name, but that like delved into like the whole timeline. I mean, the whole time travel theme, and it was super complicated, and I couldn't even keep up with it. So I think it's a lot easier to talk about time travel than to actually understand time travel. It's
Conceive
like
it,
crazy,
yeah.
yeah.
I think I know what movie you're talking about. I can't remember the name of it. I mean, I always liked the Back to the Future trilogy because they did actually take a. I think in the second movie they actually whip out a chalkboard and
Mm,
try to talk about things like timelines and some of the other implications. So I always thought that movie was cool for that.
yep.
Movie's awesome anyway. But yeah, it is like so. It is. It's interesting to think like, is that why when supposedly people see beings that might come out of craft like this, they look like just like how right now you and I, you're us, we are somewhat weaker versions of our ancestors. Like
Mm,
you and I may be taller than our ancestors because we're getting better nutrition,
yeah.
eating better, not getting sick as much, etc. But I know that they did a study and they found that like Roman soldiers were carrying like 100 pounds a day for distances that like the modern human now. So even that relatively short ago, because 2,000 years ago is not that
Yeah.
evolutionarily significant, but even they were tougher people because of their lifestyle than now. So if you just take us right now and assume computers and smartphones and all these things that eventually will be kind of, you won't even have to physically interface it at some point. It's not unreasonable to assume we'll have ways to interface with technology and make technology um, in ways where you don't have to actually touch it, right? You can use your mind, let's say, to turn on your computer or, do whatever it is you need to do. Well, then maybe those people, those beings, are just our future selves, and it's like kind of a new type of human, and they're coming back to look at us cave people and say, "Oh, remember that when they used to burn dinosaurs to power vehicles?"
Yeah,
Like
I get
that's
I
a
get what
real,
you're saying. Yeah, and
yeah.
another thing I want to quickly mention, if we have any like flat Earth enthusiasts, I definitely don't want to offend anyone with the visuals. It's just sort of what it is, and I think it's a potential topic for the future.
Oh, those flat Earth people. That would be a whole topic unto itself.
Yeah.
So yeah. Wrapping this part of the conversation up, I think that what worries me, because I know I said some pretty dire things when I went into this long, rambling spiel.
Hmm.
Um, here's what worries me is if this is really happening, if craft like this are really showing up, if beings with abilities or technology just eons past ours are showing up, well, then to me, that kind of reminds me of the big worry, I think, for anybody with alien contact is multidimensional. Here's the issue: is it's just like when the Spanish encountered the Native Americans here in North and South America, Central America, or when Europeans started voyaging and colonizing Africa and other parts of the world. So what happened? What happened when the Spanish came to the Americas? Well, first of all, a bunch of Native Americans died of the flu and smallpox. So there's like diseases that both populations have not necessarily been exposed to, but maybe one population has a much better way of fighting off those diseases or better medical technology, et cetera.
Right.
So just from that perspective, it's not too great for us to be exposed to something without, I guess, maybe some kind of protocols in place and maybe assurances from the other side that they're protecting us from the alien or interdimensional version of smallpox. But it's almost always been bad news when a very vastly advanced people shows up at the doorstep of people that are not yet to that level of technology. Usually it means it's the end of that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The people being visited, it's like you're about to be conquered. So
definitely,
that's the worrying trend. That's why when I see something and they're like, well, we spent $4 million a year to see how their engines work so well, I'm like, well, what you should be spending is about $100 million a year or more trying to understand how we can get this technology and who they are. And that's Fermi Paradox stuff again, and sort of like the past, the events that this thing opens up. There's so much to talk to. It does seem like probably some aspects of the government or the military have been taking this really seriously, but it seems like it's been compartmentalized and maybe still is, where there's this one part, like the right hand and the left hand don't necessarily know what they're doing when it comes to, let's say, our government and research and programs and things like that. And that's no surprise.
Just because of the immense size of the US. It's a very, very large country with a lot of government workers. So it's definitely not. I couldn't imagine it being like this one unit that just smoothly operates. There's probably so much, so much like politics involved and so on.
It's such a problem. Yeah, I mean, I guess with any big organization, it's always a problem to get everybody moving in the same direction. But I would say especially if you have elements within that intentionally are trying to keep their activities secret or to be obstructionist or to mislead. So that's the other thing is that and then we'll go into that in the future, is there have been cases where in the UFO community, someone claimed to know a bunch of stuff, and then 5 years later, they're like, "Oh, guess what? I was lying," and then they'll say something that makes you not sure if they're lying again, because they'll say, "Oh, the government told me to mislead you guys," and it's like, okay, well, did you just want attention, or is something like that really going on?
Oh my God,
You know what I mean?
this is so annoying. Like I definitely get what you're saying. That's so annoying.
Yeah. So it's. I mean, this topic goes way back, and I think that there's. I don't think this is ridiculous to say. There was some worry by decision makers at the top of any large population, of any size, that if something gets out that is taken as the truth, that people are not yet prepared for or can't wrap their heads around. So, like, case in point, I think in the 40s and 50s, we were worried that it might make us vulnerable to, let's say, communist infiltration or invasion or a war. Like, they were worried at one point that the Soviets were manufacturing UFO claims to put us in a panic so they could get things done or get some kind of edge over us. So that was the reason why there was actual concerted effort by the FBI. I can't remember if it was the FBI or CIA, after we read the book again, to actually intentionally make propaganda ridiculing UFOs. Yeah. So even though there were some pretty crazy events, supposedly there was a big UFO flyover right before this in Washington, D.C., where they were chasing UFOs and all this stuff, and it was really embarrassing. And after that, they're like, look, we are just going to make an effort to make anybody that talks about this topic look ridiculous. And I think that's carried on for decades now, is that we've codified that as a society or as a world culture, where anybody talking about what we're talking about today, before I would say the past couple of years, and that's why, in conclusion about this topic, I love this topic so much because not only did it come with some pretty good evidence that like, oh no, you guys aren't crazy, like there's some weird stuff going on, we don't know what it is, but for sure there's something weird going on. It's also interesting to me that a publication like the New York Times took it seriously and got a lot of traction with the public, where they have enough people with open minds now that are sort of, have had a reset, I guess, from the old days, from the,
Right.
the cultural conservatism, and are like, look, like based on media and things that we've seen, this isn't a ridiculous idea anymore. So now the challenge, of course, is to not go too far the other way, is to make sure we stay skeptical, to make sure we make our efforts to try to solve something and not just build a new mythology or a new religion.
Right. So, yeah, basically going back, because we have, talked about like aliens just in general on this episode, just like going back to this, particular case, the 2004 Nimitz UFO encounter, I also prepared the official report from the US government, as you can see on the visuals, and just a quick note to make is that the government actually acknowledged that this was a real unidentified object, and it definitely should not be taken as if this was just a speck or a malfunction on the radar system, because as you can see, the key statements from the official US military report on this case is that the anomalous aerial vehicle AAV was no known aircraft or air vehicle currently in the inventory of the United States or any foreign nation, as we've covered earlier. Also, the AAV exhibited advanced low observable characteristics at multiple radar bands, rendering US radar-based engagement capabilities ineffective. And I will definitely leave this link to this information in the description so that our listeners could look into it. So I just wanted to briefly mention this fact, just so people wouldn't consider this situation as something like small time, like a malfunction in the radar system or something like that. Because actually, when I started researching this case in particular, I sort of had that perception that this is probably a speck, almost like on the camera or like on a radar. But once I've actually looked into the case and read some of the documents, it definitely was a real occurrence. The witnesses are more than credible, and I just wanted to drive this point home that this case in particular, it's definitely something unexplainable had happened on that night, on that day, I should say.
It's such a good point. I'm really glad you called it out because and you have the exact notes, so that's perfect, so people can see really straight from the horse what the Navy said. Because they actually, even this past week, they sent out something additional to this where they're like, look, something really did happen, like this, and that's unusual because these videos were leaked, and they admitted that the videos were leaked and that they didn't want the videos out there, but now that they're out there, they are not disputing what it shows. And I guess as kind of my final thoughts about this, I'm going to echo Joe Rogan a little bit. So just full disclosure, I'm a Joe Rogan listener.
Same here.
I've been listening since maybe 2010 or so. Is that right? Maybe later. Maybe.
Oh wow, that's way back. I've been listening only for a few years.
2012, maybe that's when it is. He's of course, he has a great show, and he's always very, very long and complete, which is why I like his show so much. But yeah, I mean the thing that I mentioned Rogan. Rogan said this opinion, and it actually echoes something that I felt like for quite some time, but I think he verbalized it really well. So in response to this case, and of course several other cases where, we finally have video evidence, and you're like, come on, like part of the criticism about the UFO topic has always been that now that everybody has a phone in their pocket with a camera and a video camera, why are we not seeing more videos and pictures of UFOs like the old days? And and I will agree with some of the skeptics that, like, you know what, probably a good amount of the photos and stuff were in fact fakes in the old days when it was easier, and certainly that'll probably become easier again with the deep fake stuff. But that being said, what I noticed and what Rogan had called out was that a lot of these skeptics, when they look at a video like this and they try to pick it apart, they're not using like what's called Occam's razor. They're not using like the simplest explanation. They're not, where the simplest explanation may be probably the most likely to be the correct one. They go to all sorts of lengths of weird scenarios to try to explain, like a bug in the lens and things like that, where it's like, okay, are these all bugs in the lens? I mean, the Navy themselves are saying, no, there's not a bug in the lens. That's not what it looks like. And I don't really know how a bug stays on the lens when you're going, more than 300 miles an hour.
And also, I don't think like the U.S. Cruisers would radars would detect bugs. That would be quite the detection capability of the U.S. military.
Yeah, I mean, it gets so ridiculous with like the scenarios and the way they bend over and twist and try to make things happening that, to me, it doesn't really sound like a skeptic should be somebody who is fair, I think, who doesn't take things at face value, but tries to be, in my mind, some kind of judge, to be a little bit, to try to weigh both sides. But like in the case of these famous skeptics, they just seem to just go all in on one side, which is, against it. And it's almost like, it's almost like that skepticism becomes a irrational belief or like a ideology of its own, where it's like, how hard are you trying to not have this be real? Because I get it, like, for sure we need those voices, but we need those voices to be operating in a sane manner. So I would say anybody that's listening to us today and is like, these guys are just drinking the Kool-Aid, they're all in on the top, they don't want to hear anything that counteracts their, no, that's not true at all. I think Juras and I are both pretty even-keeled people who probably in the rest of our personal lives, just like this, have pretty even views about things and try to consider evidence and aren't necessarily like devotees. I'm
all about like investigating a case thoroughly, doing our due diligence, so I would say open-minded to like all the possibilities. I'm not saying that I 100% believe that this was a UFO, but what I believe is that we cannot explain what actually happened on 2004 November 14th, and that's my current take on it, that we can't explain what happened here, as you can see in the footage.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all I had. I mean, I know it was
yeah, well, this has been, I didn't think that we could break the record for like the last episode, but we actually have. This episode is currently, I believe, over an hour and 10 minutes. So, I mean, on my end, I think everything has been covered. Maybe you want to add something, or do you think that you've covered everything also?
I feel like we covered it. I know sort of sometimes when I was talking today, it sounded a little stream of consciousness, but I just have so many thoughts about this. I feel like this is one of those things that's like the tip of the iceberg, where if you look at it, it's pretty interesting. If you look at what's going on beneath the water, like kind of what some natural conclusions that could come out of this, there's some much bigger issues. So I really look forward to, any feedback we get on the episode. If you guys if anybody doesn't believe us or doesn't like our reasoning, please, let us know in the comments. We would love to.
Yeah, so basically, so some new developments in the Solvable Mysteries podcast is that we actually now have social medias, so you can follow us on our Facebook page, on our Twitter, on our Instagram. I will definitely leave the links in the description to all of our social medias, as well as, myself and Glenn, we greatly appreciate any sort of feedback from you guys. So if you have opinions on this case or you want to give us some sort of a criticism, it's more than welcomed, and you are welcomed to leave a comment down at the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. And also, I think fairly quick, I mean, soon we should be moving to a lot more platforms for the podcast, not just YouTube. So that's definitely going to be in the works. And yeah, this has been a fairly long podcast. I think we have covered all the main points. We definitely can come back to this topic of UFOs and maybe to this case in particular in later times. And as for this episode, I feel like we should be wrapping it up for now. So anything you want to mention to our viewers before we sign off, Glenn?
Just thank you for your interest in the topic and your patience. Really looking forward to feedback, and we hope that in the future we can potentially expand on some of the other topics we brought up in this podcast today.
Yep, definitely. So that's it from me and Glenn, and we will definitely catch you on the next episode. It should be coming out, I believe, around next Friday or Saturday. So that's it from us, guys. Stay safe, and we will catch you on the next episode. Peace out.